Deep in the ancient hollers of Appalachian Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to hillsides like the breath of sleeping giants, there exists a darkness that predates the first European settlement by centuries, a darkness that has festered in the mountain's belly, growing stronger with each passing generation, feeding on the desperation of those who dare to make bargains with forces beyond human understanding. In the winter of 1923, when the coal mines ran dry and families faced starvation, something stirred in the deepest caves of Bell County. Something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to extend its influence beyond the confines of stone and shadow. What emerged from those depths wasn't just another religious movement or backwoods congregation. It was something far more sinister, far more dangerous, and far more lasting than anyone could have imagined. The stories I'm about to share with you have been deliberately buried by local authorities, hidden in sealed court records, and whispered about only in the darkest corners of Appalachian folklore. These aren't your typical religious groups or spiritual communities. These are cults that embraced practices so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that even hardened mountain folk who had seen their share of violence and hardship would cross themselves and change the subject when their names were mentioned. What makes these particular cults so terrifying isn't just their isolation or their willingness to commit unspeakable acts. It's how they wove themselves into the very fabric of their communities, how they convinced ordinary people to participate in rituals that would make your blood run cold, and how their influence continues to seep through the mountains even today, decades after their supposed dissolution. You see, the Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where the old ways never truly died, where ancient superstitions are mixed with Christian theology to create something entirely new and often entirely dangerous. The geography itself contributed to this darkness. These weren't just remote communities, they were isolated kingdoms where charismatic leaders could establish their own twisted versions of reality, where outside law enforcement rarely ventured, and where the very landscape seemed to swallow up anyone who asked too many questions. The first cult on our list emerged from what locals called Devil's Backbone Ridge, a jagged outcropping of rock that cast unnatural shadows even at high noon. The Ridgewalkers, as they came to be known, were founded by a man named Ezekiel Morse, a former preacher who claimed to have received visions while trapped in a collapsed mine shaft for 3 days and nights. When rescue teams finally reached him, they found Morse sitting calmly in complete darkness, his eyes reflecting lamplight like those of a nocturnal animal. Morse's transformation was immediately apparent to those who knew him. Before the cave-in, he had been a mild-mannered Baptist minister who delivered predictable sermons about salvation and redemption. After his underground experience, he began preaching about the necessity of embracing darkness to truly understand light, about the power that could be gained by walking the ridge between life and death. His sermons took on a hypnotic quality that drew people from miles around, even those who had never shown interest in religion before. The Ridgewalkers established their compound in 1924, constructing a series of cabins connected by underground tunnels that mirrored the mine shafts where Morse had received his revelation. New members were required to undergo an initiation ritual called the walking, where they would be lowered into a specially constructed shaft and left in complete darkness for increasingly long periods. Most emerged changed. speaking in the same hypnotic cadence as Morse, their eyes taking on that same unsettling reflective quality. What made the Ridgewalkers particularly dangerous was their recruitment strategy. They specifically targeted families facing desperate circumstances, offering food, shelter, and a sense of purpose to those who had nothing left to lose. Children were especially valued, as Morse claimed they could more easily adapt to what he called the underground site. These children were kept in the tunnel system for weeks at a time, emerging pale and silent, moving through the compound with an eerie coordination that suggested they were operating as a collective consciousness rather than as individuals. The cult's practices became increasingly disturbing as their numbers grew. They developed a belief system centered around the idea that the earth itself was a living entity that required blood sacrifice to maintain its fertility. Monthly ceremonies involved the ritual killing of livestock, with members drinking the blood while chanting in a language that linguists who later studied recorded fragments could never identify. The ceremonies always took place in the deepest part of their tunnel system, in a chamber they called the heart, where the walls were covered with symbols carved directly into the rock. Local authorities first became aware of the Ridgewalkers in 1927, when several missing persons reports began pointing toward Devil's Backbone Ridge. When deputies attempted to investigate, they found the compound seemingly abandoned, with no signs of the nearly 200 people who had reportedly been living there. The tunnels, however, told a different story. Deep in the heart chamber, investigators found evidence of far more sinister activities than animal sacrifice. The walls were covered not just with carved symbols, but with what appeared to be human finger bones arranged in complex patterns. The floor was stained with substances that tested positive for human blood from multiple individuals. Most disturbing of all, they found a series of journals written in Morse's hand that detailed experiments in what he called consciousness transference. The entries described attempts to move human awareness from one body to another, with children being the preferred subjects due to their adaptability. The final entry in Morse's journal, dated just days before the compound's abandonment, read, "The walking has shown us the path beyond flesh. The children understand now. They are ready to become vessels for those who have been waiting in the deep places. The earth hungers, and we shall feed it not just with blood, but with the very essence of life itself. Tomorrow we descend permanently. Tomorrow we become one with the darkness that has been calling us home." No trace of the Ridgewalkers or their leader was ever found, despite extensive searches of the mountain. The compound was sealed by federal authorities, and the tunnels were filled with concrete, though local residents reported strange lights emanating from the ridge for years afterward. More disturbing still, children began disappearing from surrounding communities at a rate that exceeded statistical norms. These children were never found, but witnesses occasionally reported seeing groups of pale, silent figures moving through the forests at night, always heading toward the sealed compound. The Ridgewalkers' influence extended far beyond their physical presence. Their recruitment methods and underground initiation rituals became templates for other cults that emerged throughout the region. The idea that darkness and isolation could be used to break down individual identity and create a collective consciousness spread through the mountain communities like a virus inspiring imitators who lacked Morse's charisma but shared his twisted vision. What makes the Ridgewalkers particularly terrifying in retrospect is how they managed to operate for years without outside interference. They weren't just isolated by geography, they were protected by a network of fear and complicity that extended throughout the region. Local officials who might have investigated were either bought off, threatened, or simply chose to look the other way rather than confront something they didn't understand and couldn't control. The psychological damage inflicted by the Ridgewalkers persisted long after their disappearance. Survivors who had escaped the compound before its abandonment struggled to readjust to normal life, often suffering from what would now be recognized as severe trauma, but was then dismissed as mountain madness. Many spoke of dreams where they were called back to the tunnels, of visions of Morse's reflecting eyes watching them from shadows, of an overwhelming compulsion to return to the darkness they had once embraced. Even today, hikers and hunters in the Devil's Backbone Ridge area report unusual phenomena. Electronic equipment malfunctions near the sealed compound, animals avoid the area entirely, and the temperature drops noticeably even on warm days. Local park rangers have standing orders to discourage visitors from approaching the ridge, though they're never told exactly why. The official explanation is unstable geology, but older residents know the truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed, and in the deep places beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge, something still waits in the darkness, patient and eternal, ready to embrace anyone foolish enough to begin walking. Deep in the hollers of West Virginia, where the morning mist clings to the mountainsides like ghostly fingers, locals still speak in hushed tones about the children of the eternal flame. This wasn't your typical Appalachian religious sect. No, this was something far more sinister, something that would make even the most hardened mountain folk cross themselves and hurry past certain stretches of abandoned road. The cult emerged in 1934 during the depths of the Great Depression, when desperation drove people to seek answers in the darkest corners of human faith. Led by a charismatic preacher named Silas Blackthorne, who claimed to have received divine visions during a 3-day burial alive in a mine shaft, the Children of the Eternal Flame attracted followers from across the tri-state area. But what started as promises of salvation and prosperity quickly descended into a nightmare of ritualistic violence and psychological manipulation that would haunt the region for decades. Blackthorne had arrived in Ravens Hollow, West Virginia, in the winter of 1933, carrying nothing but a worn leather Bible and stories of miraculous healings. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing gray eyes and hands that seemed to burn with an inner fire when he laid them on the sick and suffering. Within months, he had established a compound deep in the mountains, far from the prying eyes of law enforcement and curious neighbors. The cult's central belief revolved around the concept of purification through flame. Blackthorne preached that the world was corrupt, that only through the sacred fire could souls be cleansed and made worthy of eternal paradise. He claimed that God had shown him the location of an ancient flame that had burned since the beginning of time, hidden deep within the mountain caves. This eternal flame, he declared, held the power to transform mere mortals into angels. New members were required to undergo a harrowing initiation ceremony known as the Burning Walk. Blindfolded and barefoot, initiates were led through a series of underground tunnels that Blackthorn claimed were the pathways to heaven. The tunnels were lined with torches that burned with an unusual blue flame, created by chemicals that Blackthorn had somehow acquired. The air was thick with acrid smoke that caused hallucinations and disorientation. During the ceremony, initiates were forced to walk across beds of hot coals while reciting prayers and confessions. Many suffered severe burns, but Blackthorn convinced them that their pain was a necessary sacrifice, that their scars were marks of divine favor. Those who collapsed or cried out were branded as weak and subjected to additional trials until they either broke completely or embraced the cult's twisted teachings. The compound itself was a labyrinth of interconnected buildings, all constructed around a central courtyard where a massive stone altar stood. The altar was stained dark with what members believed was sacred oil, but former members who later escaped would tell authorities it was something far more sinister. The buildings were deliberately designed to confuse outsiders, with corridors that led nowhere and rooms that could only be accessed through hidden passages. Blackthorn maintained absolute control over his followers through a combination of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and carefully orchestrated supernatural experiences. He claimed to have the power to communicate with the dead, often staging elaborate seances where the spirits of deceased loved ones would allegedly speak through him. These sessions were actually performed with the help of cult members who had been trained to hide in the walls and ceiling spaces, whispering information that Blackthorn had gathered about the participants' personal lives. The cult's daily routine was brutal and dehumanizing. Members were awakened before dawn for hours of intense prayer and meditation, followed by backbreaking labor in the compound's fields and workshops. Food was scarce and rationed, with only the most devoted followers receiving adequate nutrition. Sleep deprivation was used as a tool of control, with members kept awake for days during religious festivals and purification ceremonies. Children born into the cult faced particularly horrific treatment. Blackthorn claimed that children were closer to the divine flame and therefore needed to be tested more rigorously. Young members were subjected to increasingly dangerous rituals, including being lowered into deep pits filled with burning coals and forced to handle venomous snakes that Blackthorn claimed would not bite the truly faithful. Many children died during these trials, their deaths explained away as divine callings or failures of faith. The cult's influence extended beyond the compound through a network of businesses and front organizations. Blackthorn had established a timber company, a small mining operation, and several general stores throughout the region. These enterprises served multiple purposes. They generated income for the cult, provided cover for recruiting new members, and created a web of economic dependence that made it difficult for members to leave. Local law enforcement was either bought off or intimidated into ignoring the cult's activities. Sheriff's deputies who ventured too close to the compound often found themselves transferred to distant counties or facing mysterious accidents. The few investigators who persisted in their inquiries received packages containing personal items that could only have been obtained by breaking into their homes, along with cryptic warnings about the power of the eternal flame. The cult's most disturbing practice was the ritual of ascension, performed during the winter solstice each year. According to survivors, selected members would be chosen to become one with the eternal flame. a process that involved being sealed alive in stone chambers deep within the mountain caves. These chambers were filled with burning coal and chemical compounds that created toxic fumes. The screams of the ascending members could be heard echoing through the tunnels for hours before silence finally fell. Blackthorn convinced his followers that those who underwent ascension were not dying, but transforming into spiritual beings who would guide and protect the cult from the afterlife. He claimed that the eternal flame would preserve their consciousness, allowing them to communicate with the living through special ceremonies. In reality, the ascension ritual was simply a method of disposing of members who had become troublesome or who possessed knowledge that could threaten the cult's operations. The children of the eternal flame began to unravel in the spring of 1941 when a young woman named Sarah Mackenzie managed to escape from the compound during a chaotic night ceremony. Sarah had been born into the cult and had never known life outside the mountain community, but she had grown increasingly disturbed by the violence and death she witnessed. Her escape was aided by a sympathetic guard who had begun to question Blackthorn's teachings. Sarah's testimony to federal authorities provided the first detailed account of the cult's inner workings. She described the underground chamber where the bodies of ascended members were stored, the hidden rooms where children were imprisoned for failing to demonstrate sufficient faith, and the elaborate system of tunnels that connected the compound to caves throughout the mountain range. Most shocking of all, she revealed that Blackthorn had been systematically murdering members who attempted to leave or who possessed information that could expose the cult's criminal activities. The federal investigation that followed uncovered evidence of at least 47 deaths at the compound, though the actual number was likely much higher. Investigators found mass graves containing the remains of men, women, and children, many showing signs of torture and ritualistic mutilation. The underground chambers contained evidence of chemical experiments and psychological torture techniques that suggested Blackthorn had been using his followers as subjects for twisted research. When federal agents finally raided the compound in November 1941, they found it eerily abandoned. The buildings were empty, the sacred flame had been extinguished, and there was no sign of Blackthorn or his remaining followers. The only evidence of their presence was a series of messages carved into the walls of the main temple, written in a coded language that investigators were never able to decipher completely. The few cult members who were captured claimed that Blackthorn had achieved true ascension, that he had become one with the eternal flame and led his most devoted followers into a higher plane of existence. They insisted that the cult had not been destroyed, but had simply moved beyond the physical world, where they continued to serve their divine master. These survivors were placed in psychiatric facilities where most remained for the rest of their lives, continuing to speak of the eternal flame and their eventual reunion with their ascended brothers and sisters. The abandoned compound became a source of local legend and fear. Hikers and hunters reported seeing strange lights moving through the empty buildings at night, and several people claimed to have heard voices chanting in unknown languages echoing from the sealed cave entrances. The state government eventually declared the area off-limits to the public, citing safety concerns about unstable mine shafts and toxic chemical contamination. In the decades following the cult's disappearance, researchers and paranormal investigators have attempted to study the site, but their efforts have been hampered by a series of unexplained accidents and equipment failures. Cameras malfunction, recording devices produce only static, and visitors report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread that intensifies the longer they remain in the area. Some have claimed to see figures in white robes moving through the forest, always just at the edge of vision, always watching. The legacy of the children of the eternal flame extends far beyond the physical boundaries of their mountain compound. The cult's techniques of psychological manipulation and social control have been studied by researchers investigating extremist groups and dangerous religious movements. The case serves as a stark reminder of how charismatic leaders can exploit vulnerability and desperation to create environments where unthinkable acts become normalized and even celebrated. Local communities in West Virginia still bear the psychological scars of the cult's presence. Families were torn apart as members chose loyalty to Blackthorn over their own blood relatives. The economic disruption caused by the cult's business operations affected the region for years, and the climate of fear and suspicion that surrounded their activities damaged trust between neighbors and law enforcement. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that the children of the eternal flame may not have been entirely eliminated. Over the years, there have been reports of similar groups operating in remote areas of Appalachia, led by individuals who claim to be disciples of Silas Blackthorn. These groups allegedly practice modified versions of the cult's rituals, maintaining the belief that the eternal flame continues to burn somewhere in the mountains, waiting for worthy followers to find it and achieve ascension. The Children of the Eternal Flame represents one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, a reminder that the isolation and desperation that characterize much of the region's past have sometimes given rise to horrors that defy comprehension. The cult's story serves as a warning about the dangers of blind faith and the terrible consequences that can result when charismatic leaders exploit the trust and desperation of vulnerable people. Today, the mountain where the compound once stood remains largely uninhabited, its forests slowly reclaiming the buildings and pathways that once housed one of America's most dangerous cults. But those who know the history of the area speak of a lingering presence, a sense that something still watches from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge and continue the work that Silas Blackthorn began all those years ago. The eternal flame, they say, can never truly be extinguished, only hidden until the time comes for it to burn once more. The mountains of Appalachia have always been unforgiving to those who dare to disturb their ancient secrets. But in the winter of 1932, 3 separate cults emerged from the mist-shrouded valleys with beliefs so twisted that even the hardened mountain folk crossed themselves when speaking their names. These weren't your typical religious movements seeking salvation or enlightenment. These were organizations built on blood, terror, and the kind of rituals that federal investigators would later classify as too dangerous to document fully. What made these particular cults so deadly wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their systematic approach to breaking the human spirit before claiming their victims. They understood that in the isolated hollows of Appalachia, people disappeared all the time. Mining accidents, harsh winters, wild animals, feuding families. Death was commonplace, which made it the perfect cover for something far more sinister. The first signs of trouble came in the form of missing livestock. Entire herds would vanish overnight, leaving behind only strange symbols carved into trees and the lingering smell of something burning. Local sheriffs dismissed these incidents as cattle rustling or bear attacks, but the mountain folk knew better. They recognized the markings from old stories their grandparents whispered about entities that demanded tribute in exchange for safe passage through certain valleys. By 1933, the missing livestock had escalated to missing people. Families would wake to find relatives gone, their beds unslept in, their belongings untouched. Search parties would form, but they'd inevitably abandon their efforts when they reached certain boundaries marked by cairns of black stones arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The searchers would return home, claiming they'd heard voices calling from deep within the earth, voices that spoke in languages that predated any known settlement in the region. The Bone Hollow Assembly was the first of these cults to draw official attention. Operating from a network of caves in the Cumberland Mountains, they were led by a man known only as Father Marrow, whose real name was never discovered by authorities. What made the Bone Hollow Assembly particularly terrifying was their recruitment method. They didn't seek converts through traditional means, like preaching or community outreach. Instead, they identified families experiencing tragedy and offered them very specific forms of comfort. When a child died of illness, when a mine collapsed, when a family faced starvation, representatives of the Bone Hollow Assembly would appear at their door. These emissaries were always well-dressed, soft-spoken, and carried with them items that seemed impossible to obtain in the remote mountain regions. Fine medicines, preserved foods, quality tools, and most importantly, information about the deceased that no outsider should have known. They would tell grieving parents intimate details about their dead children, recounting private conversations and secret moments that only family members could have witnessed. They claimed these details came from the children themselves, who continued to exist in a realm accessible only through the assembly's rituals. The promise was simple: join the assembly and maintain contact with your lost loved ones. The price was equally simple: complete obedience to Father Marrow and participation in monthly gatherings that took place in the deepest chambers of the cave system. The first documented evidence of the assembly's true nature came from a teenage girl named Ruth Calverton, who escaped from their compound in March 1934. Her testimony to state police was so disturbing that portions of it were immediately classified and remain sealed to this day. According to Ruth, new members were initially welcomed with elaborate ceremonies that did indeed seem to provide contact with deceased relatives. During these gatherings, participants would drink a bitter tea brewed from mushrooms that grew only in the cave's deepest recesses, and in their altered state, they would hear the voices of their dead speaking from the darkness. But the assembly's true purpose became clear during what they called advancement ceremonies. Members who had proven their loyalty were invited to participate in more intensive rituals designed to strengthen their connection to the deceased. These ceremonies took place in a chamber Ruth described as being carved entirely from human bones, with walls that pulsed with a faint phosphorescent glow. During these gatherings, Members would be required to make increasingly significant sacrifices, first personal possessions, then livestock, then finally living human beings. Ruth's escape was discovered when she stumbled into a trading post 30 miles from the cave system, emaciated and covered in scars that formed deliberate patterns across her arms and back. She claimed that the assembly had been preparing her for what they called the final advancement, a ceremony that would allow her to join the ranks of the deceased while still maintaining her physical form. The preparation involved weeks of ritualistic scarification, fasting, and consumption of substances that caused vivid hallucinations and periods of unconsciousness. When authorities finally organized a raid on the cave system in September 1934, they found evidence of the assembly's activities that defied rational explanation. The bone chamber Ruth had described was real, constructed from human remains that forensic analysis later determined came from at least 40 different individuals. More disturbing were the journals kept by assembly members, written in a mixture of English and symbols that resembled no known language. These documents described detailed instructions for rituals involving human sacrifice, methods for preserving body parts as ceremonial objects, and most unnervingly, recipes for substances that could allegedly maintain consciousness after death. The assembly members themselves were never found. The caves showed signs of recent habitation, with food stores, sleeping areas, and ceremonial chambers all intact, but every human occupant had vanished. The only clue to their fate was a series of tunnels that extended far deeper into the mountain than any natural cave system should have reached. These passages were deliberately collapsed, apparently from the inside, sealing off whatever lay beyond. Local residents reported strange phenomena in the months following the raid. Hikers would hear voices calling from sealed cave entrances, always in the voices of people they had known who had died. Livestock began avoiding the area entirely, and hunting dogs would refuse to track game that led toward the mountains where the assembly had operated. Most disturbing were the reports of figures seen walking along ridgelines at night, always in groups, always moving in single file toward the sealed caves. The second cult, known as the Sanctified Shepherds of the Final Revelation, established their base of operations in the coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky. Unlike the Bone Hollow Assembly, which operated in secret, the Sanctified Shepherds presented themselves as a legitimate religious organization. They built a church, held regular services, and even provided charitable assistance to struggling mining families. Their leader, a charismatic preacher named Reverend Ezra Blackwood, had previously served as a Methodist minister before developing what he called a more complete understanding of divine will. The Sanctified Shepherds' theology centered around the belief that the Appalachian Mountains were a testing ground where God separated the truly faithful from the merely religious. They taught that the harsh conditions of mountain life, the constant threat of death from mining accidents, and the isolation from mainstream society were all part of a divine plan to create a purified community of believers. According to their doctrine, those who died in the mountains were not victims of circumstance, but chosen souls who had completed their earthly trials and ascended to a higher plane of existence. This belief system might have remained relatively harmless if not for the shepherds' interpretation of how one achieved this chosen status. They believed that true faith required the willing embrace of death, but not through suicide, which they considered a sin Instead, they developed a system of ritualistic trials that would supposedly demonstrate complete trust in divine protection. These trials began simply enough. Members would handle venomous snakes, drink potentially poisonous substances, and engage in other dangerous activities while praying for divine intervention. The trials escalated gradually over the course of several years. Members would be required to spend nights alone in abandoned mine shafts, to walk blindfolded along narrow mountain ledges, and to participate in ceremonies where they would be buried alive for predetermined periods while the congregation prayed for their safe return. The shepherds claimed that those who died during these trials had been chosen for immediate ascension, while survivors had proven their faith but required further testing. By 1936, the Sanctified shepherds had developed what they called the ultimate trial, the resurrection ceremony. This ritual was reserved for the most devoted members and involved a process that the shepherds claimed would demonstrate the power of faith over death itself. Participants would be required to ingest a mixture of local plants and minerals that would induce a death-like state, then be sealed in specially constructed coffins and buried in the church cemetery. The congregation would maintain continuous prayer vigils, and after 3 days, the coffins would be exhumed. Those who emerged alive were considered to have achieved a level of spiritual perfection that made them living saints within the community. The problem with the resurrection ceremony was that the substances used to induce the death-like state were highly unpredictable. Some participants would indeed enter a deep catatonic state that mimicked death, but others would simply die. The shepherds explained these deaths as divine selections, claiming that these individuals had been chosen to remain in the higher realm rather than return to earthly existence. The families of those who died were told to rejoice in their loved ones' spiritual achievement rather than mourn their loss. The Sanctified shepherds' activities came to official attention when a mining company executive noticed an unusual pattern of deaths among workers who belonged to the church. Mining was dangerous work, but the shepherds' members seemed to have a disproportionately high fatality rate, and many of these deaths occurred under circumstances that didn't match typical mining accidents. When investigators began looking into the church's practices, they discovered that the shepherds had been conducting their resurrection ceremonies on a monthly basis for over 2 years. The investigation revealed that at least 63 people had died during these ceremonies, including 17 children whose parents had volunteered them for the trials. The shepherds had maintained detailed records of each ceremony, including notes about the spiritual significance of different types of deaths and observations about the most effective combinations of substances for inducing the desired death-like state. These records were written in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested the authors viewed the deaths as scientific experiments rather than human tragedies. When authorities raided the Sanctified shepherds' compound in November 1937, they found evidence that the group had been expanding their activities beyond their own membership. They had begun approaching families in other communities, offering their services to those dealing with terminal illnesses or unbearable grief. The shepherds claimed they could provide a peaceful transition to the afterlife through their specialized knowledge of death and resurrection, and they had apparently convinced several outsiders to participate in modified versions of their ceremonies. The most disturbing discovery was a series of underground chambers beneath the church, where the shepherds had been conducting experiments on both willing and unwilling subjects. These chambers contained detailed anatomical drawings, preserved body parts, and equipment that suggested the group had been trying to develop more reliable methods for inducing and reversing death. Some of the preserved specimens showed signs of surgical modification, indicating that the shepherds had been attempting to understand the physical processes involved in their ceremonies. Like the Bone Hollow Assembly, most of the sanctified shepherds vanished before authorities could apprehend them. The few members who were captured claimed that Reverend Blackwood had led the core group into the mountains for a final ceremony that would allow them to ascend permanently to the higher realm. Search parties found evidence of a large gathering in a remote valley, including the remains of ceremonial fires and personal belongings, but no bodies. The only trace of the group's ultimate fate was a series of shallow graves containing items that belonged to the missing members, arranged as if in preparation for a mass burial that never occurred. The third and perhaps most dangerous of these cults was the Order of the Crimson Veil, which operated throughout the border regions of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Unlike the other two groups, which maintained fixed locations for their activities, the order was nomadic, moving constantly through the mountain wilderness and leaving behind only rumors and disappearances. Their leader was known as the Crimson Mother, described by witnesses as a woman of indeterminate age who wore elaborate robes dyed with what appeared to be human blood. The order's beliefs were built around the concept of blood as a sacred substance that connected all living things. They taught that by consuming the blood of others, one could absorb their memories, knowledge, and spiritual essence. The ultimate goal was to achieve a state of perfect understanding by consuming the blood of individuals who represented different aspects of human experience: innocence, wisdom, courage, love, fear, and dozens of other emotional and spiritual states. The Order's recruitment methods were particularly insidious. They would approach isolated families and offer to solve their problems through what they called blood healing. Sick children would be promised cures, failing crops would be promised fertility, and struggling families would be promised prosperity. The Order claimed they could achieve these miraculous results by sharing the blood of those who had overcome similar challenges, transferring their strength and success to those in need. Initial treatments appeared to work exactly as promised. Sick children would recover, crops would flourish, and families would experience sudden improvements in their circumstances. But these improvements came with a price. Recipients were expected to contribute their own blood to help others facing similar challenges. The Order explained that this was necessary to maintain the balance of spiritual forces and ensure that the benefits continued. The blood collection process began with small amounts taken during ceremonial gatherings, but the Order's demands gradually increased. Members were required to provide larger quantities of blood at more frequent intervals, and eventually they were expected to recruit family members and friends to join the healing network. The Order claimed that the more blood they collected, the more powerful their healing abilities became, and they began promising increasingly dramatic results: resurrection of the dead, eternal youth, and supernatural abilities. By 1938, the Order had established a network of contributors throughout the mountain regions, with members providing blood on a regular schedule in exchange for continued protection and healing. The system was maintained through a combination of fear and genuine belief, as many members had experienced real improvements in their lives that they attributed to the Order's interventions. Those who attempted to leave the network were told that their previous healing would be reversed, and they would experience suffering far worse than their original problems. The Order's true nature became apparent when a member named Jacob Hensley attempted to document their activities. Hensley had initially joined the Order, seeking a cure for his wife's consumption, and when the treatment appeared successful, he became a devoted follower. But as he became more involved with the group's inner workings, he began to suspect that their healing methods were not as supernatural as they claimed. Hensley's investigation revealed that the Order was using detailed knowledge of local communities to stage many of their miraculous results. They would research families before approaching them, learning about their problems and identifying practical solutions that could be implemented while the healing ceremonies provided a cover story. The Order's members included individuals with medical knowledge, agricultural expertise, and connections to regional business networks that allowed them to provide genuine assistance while maintaining the illusion of supernatural intervention. But the Order's deception extended beyond mere fraud. Hensley discovered that they were conducting medical experiments on their members, using the blood collection process to study the effects of various substances and procedures. Members who provided blood were unknowingly participating in tests of different drugs, toxins, and surgical techniques. The Order maintained detailed records of these experiments, tracking the health and behavior of their subjects over extended periods. The most horrifying aspect of the Order's activities was their systematic harvesting of blood from unwilling victims. Members who could no longer provide sufficient quantities of blood voluntarily were subjected to increasingly invasive collection procedures. The Order had developed techniques for keeping victims alive while extracting large amounts of blood over extended periods, and they had established hidden facilities throughout the mountain regions where these procedures could be carried out without detection. Hensley's attempt to expose the Order resulted in his own disappearance, but not before he had hidden detailed documentation of their activities in locations that were eventually discovered by authorities. His records revealed that the Order had been responsible for hundreds of disappearances over a period of nearly a decade, and that they had developed an extensive network of accomplices who helped them identify and capture suitable victims. The investigation into the Order of the Crimson Veil was complicated by the fact that many of their members genuinely believed in the group's healing abilities and were willing to protect them from outside interference. When authorities attempted to raid suspected Order facilities, they often found communities that were united in their denial of any wrongdoing. The Order had created a system where victims and perpetrators were often the same people, making it difficult to distinguish between those who needed rescue and those who needed to be prosecuted. The Order's ultimate fate remains unknown. Unlike the other two cults, which disappeared suddenly and completely, the Order of the Crimson Veil seemed to fade gradually from the region. Reports of their activities became less frequent throughout the early 1940s, and by the end of the decade, they had apparently ceased operations entirely. Some investigators believe that the Order's leadership was killed or captured during one of the many raids conducted during this period, while others suspect that they simply moved their operations to a different region. The legacy of these three cults extends far beyond their immediate victims. Their activities created a climate of fear and suspicion throughout the Appalachian region that persisted for decades. Families became reluctant to trust strangers, religious movements were viewed with suspicion, and any unusual deaths or disappearances were immediately attributed to cult activity. The mountain communities, already isolated and insular, became even more closed to outside influence, as residents struggled to distinguish between legitimate religious expression and dangerous fanaticism. The psychological impact on survivors was equally profound. Those who had been members of these cults or had lost family members to their activities often required years of recovery to overcome the trauma. Many never fully recovered their ability to trust others or to participate in normal community life. The children who survived these experiences were particularly affected, often displaying behavioral problems and psychological symptoms that persisted into adulthood. Perhaps most disturbing was the way these cults had exploited the genuine spiritual needs of their communities. The Appalachian region had always been characterized by strong religious traditions and a deep connection to the supernatural aspects of mountain life. The cults perverted these traditions, using familiar religious language and concepts to mask their true intentions. This made it difficult for community members to recognize the danger until it was too late, and it created lasting damage to the region's religious institutions. The federal investigations into these cults also revealed significant gaps in law enforcement capabilities in remote rural areas. The isolation that had allowed these groups to operate undetected for so long also made it difficult for authorities to conduct effective investigations once their activities were discovered. The lack of communication infrastructure, the challenging terrain, and the reluctance of local residents to cooperate with outside investigators all contributed to the difficulties faced by law enforcement. The winter of 1935 brought more than just bitter cold to the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky. It brought the Thornwood Collective, a group that would make the previous cults we've discussed look like mere children playing with dangerous toys. Founded by a charismatic former seminary student named Matthias Thornwood, this organization didn't just exploit Appalachian isolation like the others. They systematically weaponized it, turning entire communities into willing accomplices in acts so depraved that even hardened federal investigators would later refuse to discuss the details publicly. What made the Thornwood Collective particularly insidious was their approach to recruitment. While other cults relied on fear and coercion, Thornwood understood something far more sinister about human nature. He knew that people would willingly participate in the most horrific acts if they believed it served a greater purpose, and he was devastatingly effective at convincing them that purpose existed. Matthias Thornwood arrived in the coal mining town of Blackwater Creek during the height of the Great Depression. The mines had closed, families were starving, and hope had become as scarce as paying work. Into this desperation walked a man who seemed to have answers. Well-dressed, articulate, and possessing an almost hypnotic speaking ability, Thornwood began holding evening gatherings in an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. His message was seductive in its simplicity. The suffering of the mountain people wasn't random or meaningless. It was a test, a purification process designed to prepare them for a great awakening. Those who endured would be rewarded not just with earthly prosperity, but with spiritual powers that would elevate them above ordinary humanity. The key to unlocking these powers, according to Thornwood, lay in embracing suffering completely, both their own and that of others. The early meetings seemed innocuous enough. Thornwood would lead discussions about Scripture, focusing on passages about suffering, sacrifice, and redemption. He had a remarkable ability to twist biblical passages to support his increasingly dark theology. The Book of Job became a manual for enduring torment. The crucifixion became evidence that the greatest spiritual advancement required the most extreme suffering. But these theological discussions were merely the foundation for something far more sinister. Thornwood began introducing what he called exercises in spiritual fortitude. Members would be asked to perform increasingly uncomfortable acts as demonstrations of their commitment. At first, these were relatively minor: fasting for extended periods, sleeping on bare floors, deliberately exposing themselves to cold or heat. As winter deepened, so did the demands. Members were required to bring their children to special ceremonies where they would witness increasingly disturbing rituals. Thornwood claimed that exposing children to controlled suffering would strengthen their spiritual development and prepare them for the harsh realities of the world. Parents who questioned these practices were told they lacked faith and were potentially endangering their children's eternal souls. The first disappearance occurred in February 1936. A traveling salesman named Robert Hayes had stopped in Blackwater Creek and made the mistake of openly criticizing what he called that lunatic preacher and his crazy followers. Hayes was last seen leaving the town's only boarding house after dark. His automobile was discovered a week later, abandoned in a ravine with no sign of the driver. When the local sheriff, Thomas Brennan, began investigating, he encountered something unprecedented in his 15 years of law enforcement. The entire community seemed to have developed collective amnesia about the missing man. Shopkeepers claimed they'd never seen him. The boarding house owner insisted no one by that name had ever stayed there. Even Hayes's automobile registration, which Brennan had personally verified, mysteriously vanished from the county records. More disturbing was the atmosphere in the town itself. Brennan later described it as feeling like he was walking through a community of sleepwalkers. People moved through their daily routines mechanically, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact. Children, normally boisterous and curious, seemed unnaturally subdued. The few residents who would speak to him did so in carefully measured phrases, as if they were reciting memorized responses. The truth began to emerge when Brennan received an anonymous letter written in a shaking hand and delivered to his home under cover of darkness. The letter, which he later turned over to federal authorities, contained a single paragraph that chilled him to the bone. The preacher says, "Suffering is the path to godliness. We have learned to make others suffer so we don't have to. The traveling man suffered greatly before he found peace. We all watched. We all participated. God forgive us, but we're going to do it again." By spring, the pattern had become clear. The Thornwood Collective had evolved beyond a religious cult into something far more dangerous. They had become a community-wide conspiracy dedicated to the systematic torture and murder of outsiders. Thornwood had convinced his followers that by inflicting suffering on others, they were absorbing spiritual power while simultaneously protecting themselves from hardship. The mechanics of their operation were horrifyingly sophisticated. Potential victims were identified through a network of informants that extended far beyond Blackwater Creek. Traveling salesmen, government officials, journalists, anyone who might pose a threat to their isolation or bring unwanted attention to their activities. These individuals would be lured to the town through various pretexts, often involving fake business opportunities or requests for assistance. Once in Blackwater Creek, the victims would be isolated and captured. What happened next was documented in journals that federal agents discovered during their eventual raid, journals so disturbing that they remain classified to this day. According to the few details that have been released, the Thornwood Collective had developed elaborate rituals around the infliction of suffering. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully choreographed ceremonies designed to maximize both physical and psychological torment. The entire community participated in these rituals. Men, women, and children all had assigned roles in what Thornwood called the Great Work. Parents would bring their children to witness the proceedings, claiming it was necessary for their spiritual education. The children, in turn, were gradually introduced to more active participation as they grew older. What made this system particularly sustainable was Thornwood's genius for psychological manipulation. He had created a closed loop of complicity where every member of the community was equally guilty and equally dependent on the group's continued secrecy. No one could report the crimes without implicating themselves. No one could leave without risking exposure of their own participation. The collective's activities might have continued indefinitely if not for a single miscalculation. In the summer of 1938, they targeted a man named David Morrison, believing him to be a traveling insurance salesman. Morrison was actually a federal agent investigating reports of missing persons in the region. When he failed to report in as scheduled, a massive federal operation was launched to locate him. The raid on Blackwater Creek involved over 200 federal agents, state police, and National Guard members. What they discovered defied belief. The abandoned church had been converted into what investigators described as a torture cathedral. The basement contained cells where victims had been held, along with an array of implements designed to inflict maximum suffering. More disturbing were the detailed records the collective had maintained, documenting not just their crimes, but their theological justifications for them. The community's response to the raid was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. Rather than fleeing or attempting to destroy evidence, the residents of Blackwater Creek simply waited. They offered no resistance, made no attempts to escape, and showed no signs of remorse or fear. When questioned, they responded with the same mechanical precision Sheriff Brennan had observed years earlier, as if they were following a script. Matthias Thornwood himself was never found. His followers claimed he had departed several days before the raid, but they seemed genuinely unclear about where he had gone or when he might return. Some spoke of him as if he were still present, referring to recent conversations and instructions that made no sense given his absence. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the scale of the complicity. Virtually every adult in Blackwater Creek had participated in the collective's activities in some capacity. The federal prosecutors faced the unprecedented challenge of trying an entire community for crimes that defied existing legal frameworks. How do you prosecute a grandmother for holding a flashlight while her neighbors tortured a stranger to death? How do you sentence a child who had been raised to believe that such acts were not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary? In the end, the most active participants received lengthy prison sentences, while others were placed in what amounted to federal supervision. The town of Blackwater Creek was essentially disbanded, its residents relocated to different communities across the region. The collective's property was seized and eventually destroyed, though not before investigators had documented every horrific detail of their operations. But the Thornwood Collective's influence didn't end with their capture. Federal investigators discovered that Thornwood had been in correspondence with similar groups across the Appalachian region. His theological writings and operational methods had been shared with other isolated communities, creating a network of like-minded organizations that operated independently but shared common goals and techniques. Over the following decades, law enforcement agencies would encounter scattered groups that bore the unmistakable influence of Thornwood's teachings. These weren't direct descendants of the original collective, but rather independent organizations that had adopted and adapted his methods. The idea that suffering could be transferred from one person to another through ritualized violence had taken root in the darkest corners of Appalachian society. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and long-lasting. Many of the collective's former members, even those who had been children at the time, struggled with severe mental health issues for the rest of their lives. Some spoke also of being unable to form normal relationships, haunted by memories of participating in acts they couldn't fully comprehend. Others described a persistent sense of spiritual emptiness, as if Thornwood's twisted theology had permanently damaged their ability to find meaning in conventional religious or philosophical frameworks. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of former members who seemed to retain some belief in Thornwood's teachings, even decades later. These individuals, now scattered across the country, would occasionally surface in police reports involving unusual crimes or disturbing behavior. They spoke of the collective not as a criminal organization they had escaped, but as a spiritual community they had lost. The federal government's response to the Thornwood Collective marked a turning point in how authorities approached cult-related crimes in isolated communities. New protocols were developed for identifying and infiltrating such groups, while psychological experts were brought in to help understand the mechanisms of mass complicity that had made the collective possible, yet questions remained. How had Thornwood acquired such sophisticated knowledge of psychological manipulation? His background as a seminary student hardly seemed adequate preparation for the elaborate system of control he had developed. Some investigators theorized that he had studied the methods of other cults, perhaps even received training from unknown sources. Others suggested that his techniques represented a natural evolution of existing Appalachian social structures, taken to their logical extreme. The true extent of the Thornwood Collective's crimes may never be known. Their own records, while detailed, were often written in coded language that defied complete interpretation. The physical evidence, much of it destroyed in the federal raid, left gaps that investigators could never fully fill. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 40 people disappeared in the region during the collective's active period, though the actual number may have been significantly higher. Today, the site of Blackwater Creek remains largely abandoned. The few structures that survived the federal cleanup have been reclaimed by the forest, their foundations barely visible beneath decades of growth. Local residents avoid the area, though whether from superstition or genuine knowledge of its history is unclear. Yet the Thornwood Collective's legacy persists in more subtle ways. Sociologists studying cult behavior continue to reference their case as an example of how entire communities can be transformed into instruments of violence. Their methods of psychological control have been studied by everyone from academic researchers to law enforcement trainers, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic leadership in isolated communities. More troubling are the persistent reports of Thornwood-influenced activity in the modern era. While no organization has matched the scale or sophistication of the original collective, smaller groups bearing similar characteristics have been identified across the Appalachian region. These groups tend to be highly secretive and difficult to infiltrate, suggesting that the lessons of Blackwater Creek have been learned by both law enforcement and those who would continue Thornwood's work. The question that haunts investigators to this day is whether Matthias Thornwood himself survived the federal raid. No body was ever found, and his followers' claims about his departure were never verified. Some theorists suggest that he may have anticipated the raid and escaped to establish new operations elsewhere. Others believe he may have been killed by his own followers, either as part of some final ritual or to prevent his capture and testimony. Whatever his fate, Thornwood's influence on Appalachian cult activity cannot be overstated. His synthesis of religious manipulation, psychological control, and systematic violence created a template that would inspire imitators for generations. The Thornwood Collective represented not just a criminal organization, but a dark evolution in how isolated communities could be transformed into instruments of terror. The mountains of Appalachia have always harbored secrets, but few as dark as those buried beneath the ruins of Blackwater Creek. In a region where isolation breeds both independence and vulnerability, the Thornwood Collective demonstrated how quickly a community's strength can be perverted into its greatest weakness. Their story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous cults are often those that don't seem like cults at all, but rather like communities that have simply taken their beliefs one step too far into the darkness. The fifth deadliest cult to emerge from Appalachian soil was perhaps the most insidious because they never called themselves a cult at all. They were simply known as the Mountain Shepherds, and their influence spread through the region like a sickness disguised as salvation. In the autumn of 1938, as the Great Depression continued its stranglehold on rural America, a charismatic preacher named Ezra Whitmore arrived in the remote valleys of eastern Tennessee. Unlike the fire and brimstone evangelists who typically visited these forgotten communities, Whitmore spoke in gentle tones about suffering as a pathway to divine understanding. He carried with him an ancient leather-bound book that he claimed contained lost scriptures, writings that had been deliberately hidden from mainstream Christianity because they revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of God's love. Whitmore established his first gathering in a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by towering pines where sound carried in strange ways. The acoustics were so perfect that a whisper spoken at the center could be heard clearly by anyone standing along the rim. Local geology couldn't explain this phenomenon, but Whitmore seemed to understand it intimately, positioning himself at the precise focal point where his voice would reach every listener with unsettling clarity. The mountain shepherd's doctrine was seductive in its simplicity. Whitmore taught that conventional Christianity had been corrupted by comfort, that true believers must embrace suffering to achieve spiritual elevation. He spoke of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, not as a test of faith, but as a transformation through deliberate deprivation. Pain, he claimed, was the purest form of prayer, and those who could endure the greatest suffering would achieve the closest communion with the divine. What began as extended fasting and sleep deprivation gradually escalated into more extreme practices. Whitmore introduced the concept of sacred wounds, teaching followers that physical injury could serve as a form of spiritual communication. Members would gather in the mountain amphitheater during new moon nights when darkness was absolute and participate in what they called communion through suffering. The rituals started with minor self-inflicted cuts, participants using consecrated knives to make small incisions on their arms and hands. As blood flowed, Whitmore would lead them in hypnotic chanting, his voice echoing unnaturally through the mountain hollow. Followers reported experiencing visions during these sessions, claiming to see angels or deceased relatives speaking to them through the pain. The psychological effects were profound, with participants describing feelings of euphoria and spiritual connection that lasted for days afterward. But Whitmore's true genius lay in his understanding of human psychology. He never forced anyone to participate in the more extreme practices. Instead, he created a hierarchy within the group based on one's willingness to endure suffering. Those who could withstand greater pain were elevated to positions of leadership, granted access to supposedly deeper spiritual truths, and given authority over other members. This system turned suffering into a currency of status, with followers competing to prove their devotion through increasingly severe self-harm. The mountain shepherds attracted adherents from across the Appalachian region, drawing desperate families who had lost everything in the economic collapse. Whitmore's message of finding meaning through suffering resonated with people who were already enduring tremendous hardship. He offered them a framework to transform their pain into purpose, their desperation into divine calling. As the cult grew, so did the intensity of their practices. Whitmore introduced trials of faith that involved members subjecting themselves to extreme physical ordeals. They would fast for weeks at a time, consuming only water and wild herbs that Whitmore claimed possessed spiritual properties. They practiced exposure rituals, spending nights naked in the mountain wilderness during winter months, believing that surviving the cold would bring them closer to God. The most disturbing development was the emergence of what Whitmore called proxy suffering. He taught that the pain of one believer could serve as spiritual currency for another, that a parent's suffering could redeem a child's sins, or that a devoted follower could take on the spiritual burden of an entire community. This doctrine led to horrific practices where members would voluntarily undergo torture to supposedly cleanse the souls of others. Children born into the mountain shepherds were raised in an environment where pain was normalized and even celebrated. They were taught that their capacity for suffering was a gift from God, that their young bodies were vessels for divine communication. Former members who later escaped described witnessing children as young as 8 participating in blood rituals, their small hands gripping consecrated knives as adults guided them through the motions of sacred wounding. The cult's influence extended far beyond their immediate membership. Whitmore established a network of safe houses throughout the region, remote cabins where followers could retreat for intensive spiritual preparation. These locations became centers of increasingly extreme practices, places where members would spend months in isolation, subjecting themselves to deprivation and self-harm under the guidance of Whitmore's most devoted disciples. Local authorities became aware of the mountain shepherds after several members were hospitalized with severe injuries that they claimed were self-inflicted during religious ceremonies. However, investigating the cult proved nearly impossible. Members were genuinely devoted to their beliefs, refusing to cooperate with law enforcement and claiming that any interference was persecution of their religious freedom. The psychological manipulation employed by the mountain shepherds was sophisticated and effective. Whitmore understood that physical pain could create powerful chemical changes in the brain, releasing endorphins that produced feelings of euphoria and spiritual connection. He used this knowledge to create genuine addiction to the suffering rituals, with members becoming psychologically dependent on the pain-induced highs they experienced during ceremonies. More insidiously, Whitmore gradually isolated members from the outside world, convincing them that their families and former communities were spiritually contaminated. He taught that only through complete separation from worldly influences could they achieve true enlightenment. This isolation made it increasingly difficult for members to maintain perspective on their experiences or to seek help when the practices became unbearable. The mountain shepherd's ultimate fate remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Appalachian history. In the spring of 1943, after nearly 5 years of operation, the cult simply vanished. When authorities finally gained access to their mountain amphitheater, they found evidence of the group's final gathering, but no trace of the members themselves. The scene discovered by investigators was profoundly unsettling. The natural amphitheater was covered in symbols carved into the rock faces, intricate patterns that seemed to spiral inward toward the center where Whitmore typically conducted his ceremonies. The ground was stained with what appeared to be massive amounts of blood, far more than could have come from the typical ritual cutting practices. Most disturbing were the personal belongings found scattered throughout the site. Hundreds of items, clothing, jewelry, photographs, children's toys, were arranged in careful patterns around the amphitheater. Each item had been marked with the same symbol, a twisted cross that combined Christian imagery with designs that anthropologists couldn't identify. The arrangement suggested a deliberate ritual preparation, as though the members had carefully organized their worldly possessions before something. The investigation revealed that the mountain shepherds had been planning what they called the Great Ascension for months before their disappearance. According to documents found in their abandoned safe houses, Whitmore had convinced his followers that they were approaching a moment of spiritual transformation that would allow them to transcend physical existence entirely. The process, he claimed, would require the ultimate sacrifice, the complete surrender of their earthly forms through collective suffering. Search efforts in the surrounding wilderness found no trace of the missing cult members. No bodies, no evidence of mass graves, no indication of where nearly 200 people could have gone. The only clue was a series of caves discovered deep in the mountain, their entrances carefully sealed with stones and marked with the same twisted cross symbol found at the amphitheater. When authorities finally broke through these barriers, they found chambers that had been prepared for some unknown purpose. The walls were covered in writing, thousands of words carved directly into the stone in a mixture of English and symbols that linguists couldn't decipher. The text appeared to be a combination of religious doctrine and detailed instructions for rituals involving extreme physical suffering. The psychological impact of the mountain shepherds extended far beyond their immediate membership. Families throughout the region had lost loved ones to the cult, and the sudden disappearance left them with no closure, no understanding of what had happened to their relatives. Children who had been raised in the cult but were too young to participate in the final ceremony were found in various locations, abandoned but alive, their minds shattered by years of exposure to systematic suffering. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that the mountain shepherds' influence had been spreading through underground networks long before their disappearance. Investigators found evidence of similar groups operating in isolated communities across Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina, all following variations of Whitmore's doctrine of redemption through suffering. These affiliated groups had been sharing resources, members, and increasingly extreme practices, creating a regional network of pain-based spirituality. The legacy of the mountain shepherds continues to haunt the Appalachian region. Mental health professionals working in rural areas report encountering individuals who display symptoms consistent with exposure to systematic trauma and psychological manipulation. Some claim to be descendants of cult members, carrying forward twisted versions of Whitmore's teachings that emphasize self-harm as a form of spiritual discipline. Local hospitals still occasionally treat patients with injuries that suggest ritualistic self-harm, wounds that are too precise and symbolic to be accidental. These individuals rarely provide coherent explanations for their conditions, speaking instead in fragmented religious language that echoes the mountain shepherd's doctrine. When pressed for details, they often claim that their suffering serves a higher purpose, that their pain is part of a larger spiritual work that must continue. The mountain amphitheater, where the mountain shepherds held their ceremonies, remains a place of unease. Park rangers and hikers report strange acoustic phenomena in the area, sounds that seem to come from underground sources. Some describe hearing faint chanting on windless nights, voices that seem to rise from the earth itself, speaking in languages that sound almost familiar but remain incomprehensible. The true horror of the mountain shepherds lies not in their mysterious disappearance, but in their systematic transformation of human suffering into a form of worship. They took people's natural capacity for pain and twisted it into something sacred, creating a belief system that made torment feel like transcendence. Their doctrine spread through communities like a virus, infecting families and destroying lives while promising spiritual elevation through physical degradation. Even today, in the remote hollows of Appalachia, there are whispers of groups that still follow variations of Whitmore's teachings. They gather in secret, sharing techniques for spiritual suffering and maintaining the belief that pain is the most direct path to divine connection. These modern inheritors of the mountain shepherd's legacy operate in complete secrecy, their practices hidden beneath the veneer of conventional religious activity. The mountain shepherds proved that the most dangerous cults are often those that appear to offer hope to the hopeless. By targeting communities already devastated by economic hardship and social isolation, they found fertile ground for their message of redemption through suffering. Their legacy serves as a chilling reminder that in the darkest corners of human experience, even pain itself can be weaponized and transformed into a tool of control and manipulation. Deep in the misty hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the morning fog clings to ancient ridgelines like forgotten prayers, stands a weathered stone marker that locals refuse to acknowledge. Carved into its surface are 7 names, each representing a bloodline that once controlled these mountains through methods so disturbing that even hardened federal agents abandoned their investigations. The marker bears a simple inscription, "The seventh took them all." This refers to the most secretive and arguably most dangerous cult to ever emerge from Appalachian soil, a group that didn't just practice dark rituals, but perfected them into something approaching science. The seventh circle of sacred sorrows began as most mountain cults do, with desperation and isolation. But what transformed it into something far more sinister was the arrival of a man who claimed no earthly name, only referring to himself as the cartographer. According to surviving testimonies from those who escaped the cult's influence, the cartographer possessed an uncanny ability to map not just physical terrain, but what he called the spiritual geography of human suffering. He arrived in Bell County in the winter of 1934, carrying nothing but a leather satchel filled with hand-drawn maps that showed places that didn't exist on any official survey. The cult's formation began with the cartographer's systematic recruitment of 7 specific families, each chosen for what he termed their generational resonance with sacred pain. These weren't random selections, but carefully calculated choices based on his study of local genealogies, death records, and what he called blood memory. The 7 founding families were the Holcombs, who had lost 3 generations of firstborn sons to mining accidents, the Pratts, whose women had suffered an unusually high rate of stillbirths, the Covingtons, marked by a hereditary condition that caused excruciating joint pain, the Meadows family, plagued by a form of inherited blindness that struck in early adulthood, the Bowmans, whose children were born with a rare neurological disorder causing constant tremors, the Ashers, who suffered from a genetic condition that made their skin hypersensitive to sunlight, and the Reeds, whose bloodline carried a form of hereditary depression so severe that suicide was considered inevitable. The cartographer convinced these families that their suffering wasn't random but purposeful, that their pain was actually a form of spiritual currency that could be harvested, concentrated, and utilized to achieve transcendence. He taught them that most people experienced suffering as waste, allowing their pain to dissipate uselessly into the universe. But through proper techniques, suffering could be collected, refined, and transformed into what he called sacred energy. The cult's central doctrine held that the universe was structured in 7 concentric circles of increasing spiritual intensity, with ordinary human existence confined to the outermost ring. Only through the systematic cultivation and offering of suffering could one progress toward the inner circles, ultimately reaching the 7th and most sacred level. The cult established their primary compound in a remote valley that the cartographer had marked on his maps as a convergence point. Here, they constructed 7 circular buildings, each designed to house the ritualistic suffering of one of the founding families. These structures were built according to precise specifications that the cartographer claimed were revealed to him through visions. Each building contained a central chamber where family members would gather to engage in what they called sacred endurance. The rituals began simply enough with members sharing their natural pain, whether physical or emotional, with the group. But as the cult's practices evolved, they began to view natural suffering as insufficient for their spiritual goals. The progression from passive suffering to active cultivation marked the cult's transformation from a peculiar religious sect to something far more dangerous. The cartographer introduced increasingly extreme practices designed to generate the intense suffering he claimed was necessary for spiritual advancement. Members were taught to view their bodies as vessels for sacred pain, with each sensation of agony bringing them closer to divine understanding. The cult developed elaborate ceremonies where participants would engage in prolonged fasting, exposure to extreme temperatures, and eventually carefully orchestrated physical trauma. The most disturbing aspect of the 7th Circle's practices was their systematic approach to psychological suffering. The cartographer had studied what he called the architecture of despair, mapping the precise emotional states that generated the most spiritually potent anguish. Cult members were subjected to carefully designed psychological torments, including forced separation from loved ones, the deliberate destruction of cherished possessions, and elaborate gaslighting techniques designed to shatter their sense of reality. Children born into the cult were raised according to specific protocols intended to maximize their capacity for suffering while maintaining their psychological stability enough to participate in rituals. The cult's influence extended far beyond their immediate members through what they called the network of sorrows. The cartographer had identified individuals throughout the region who, while not formal cult members, could be influenced to generate suffering that would benefit the group's spiritual work. These unwitting participants included people dealing with chronic illness, families experiencing financial ruin, and individuals struggling with mental health issues. Cult members would insert themselves into these people's lives, posing as helpful neighbors or concerned friends, while actually manipulating circumstances to amplify their target's suffering. Local authorities first became aware of the cult's activities in 1938, when a postal worker reported that mail to the remote valley had stopped entirely. When a county deputy investigated, he found the compound's buildings intact but completely abandoned, with no sign of the approximately 60 people who had been living there. More disturbing was the discovery of detailed records documenting the cult's activities, including meticulous charts tracking the suffering levels of individual members and elaborate diagrams showing what appeared to be plans for expanding their operations to neighboring counties. The investigation revealed that the cult had been conducting what they called suffering experiments on both members and outsiders. These experiments involved the systematic infliction of physical and psychological pain while carefully monitoring the subject's responses. The goal was to identify the precise combinations of suffering that would generate the maximum spiritual energy. The records included detailed accounts of procedures that investigators described as torture, though cult members apparently participated willingly, believing they were advancing towards spiritual enlightenment. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of the cult's harvest schedules, which indicated they had been collecting suffering not just from their own members, but from people throughout the region. The schedules showed planned events designed to generate community-wide anguish, including the deliberate contamination of water supplies to cause illness, the strategic starting of fires to destroy homes, and the orchestrated spread of rumors designed to tear families apart. Each event was carefully timed according to lunar cycles and astrological calculations that the cartographer claimed would maximize the spiritual potency of the resulting suffering. The cult's disappearance remained a mystery until 1943, when a group of hunters discovered a cave system in the mountains above the abandoned compound. Inside, they found evidence of the cult's final ritual, which appeared to involve the simultaneous sacrifice of all remaining members. The cave walls were covered with the same mysterious maps that the cartographer had carried, but these showed not earthly locations, but what appeared to be detailed charts of spiritual realms. At the center of the main chamber, investigators found a circular arrangement of human remains, positioned according to the cult's seven-family structure. The most disturbing discovery was a series of journals written in the cartographer's hand, documenting what he called the Great Transition. According to these writings, the cult had achieved their ultimate goal of reaching the seventh circle of sacred sorrows, but this transition required the complete abandonment of physical existence. The final entries described elaborate preparations for what the cartographer termed the collective ascension, where all members would simultaneously undergo a process that would transform their accumulated suffering into pure spiritual energy. The investigation into the seventh circle was quietly closed by federal authorities, with all evidence classified under national security provisions. However, the cult's influence didn't end with their disappearance. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the region experienced an unusual number of unexplained incidents involving extreme suffering. Families would report sudden outbreaks of mysterious illnesses. Children would disappear for days before returning with no memory of their absence, and people would experience vivid nightmares featuring the same symbols found in the cult's compound. Local folklore began to incorporate stories about the Sorrow Watchers, shadowy figures who would appear during times of intense community suffering. These entities were said to feed on pain and anguish, growing stronger during tragedies and disasters. Some residents reported seeing figures in the mist during funerals, standing at the edge of crowds and seeming to absorb the grief of mourners. Others claimed to have encountered these beings during personal crises, describing them as offering comfort while somehow intensifying their emotional pain. The most persistent legend involves the cartographer himself, who many believe never truly died but achieved some form of immortal existence through his mastery of suffering. Witnesses report encounters with a tall, thin figure carrying an old leather satchel who appears to those experiencing intense physical or emotional pain. These encounters typically involve the figure offering to help alleviate the person's suffering, but those who accept his assistance reportedly find their pain temporarily relieved, only to return in magnified form, often spreading to affect their entire family. Modern investigators have attempted to locate the cave system where the cult's remains were discovered, but despite detailed records from the 1943 investigation, the location seems to have vanished entirely. GPS coordinates lead to solid rock faces, and satellite imagery shows no cave openings in the described area. Some researchers theorize that the cult's final ritual may have involved the physical alteration of the landscape itself, sealing their sacred space away from the ordinary world. The cult's influence on contemporary Appalachian culture remains subtle but persistent. Mental health professionals in the region report an unusually high incidence of what they term inherited trauma, where individuals experience intense psychological distress that seems to have no basis in their personal history. These cases often involve recurring nightmares featuring circular stone chambers, the sensation of being watched by unseen entities, and an overwhelming compulsion to seek out sources of physical or emotional pain. The Seventh Circle's most lasting legacy may be the way it transformed the regional understanding of suffering itself. In areas where the cult operated, pain and hardship are viewed not just as unfortunate circumstances, but as potentially dangerous spiritual forces that must be carefully managed. Local customs have evolved to include elaborate rituals for cleansing suffering, ensuring that personal pain doesn't accumulate to levels that might attract unwanted attention from entities that feed on human anguish. The cult's documentation techniques have influenced modern researchers studying the psychology of pain and trauma. The cartographers' detailed charts mapping the relationship between physical suffering and psychological states were decades ahead of their time in terms of understanding how pain affects human consciousness. However, the ethical implications of how this knowledge was obtained have prevented most academic institutions from acknowledging the cult's contributions to pain research. Today, the valley where the Seventh Circle established their compound remains uninhabited, though it's not officially protected or restricted. Local real estate records show numerous attempts to develop the land, but every project has been abandoned due to what developers describe as unusual difficulties. Construction workers report equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and a general sense of unease that makes sustained work impossible. The few structures that have been built in the area are eventually abandoned, with residents citing chronic health problems and persistent feelings of being watched. The 7 founding families of the cult have left no direct descendants, as the bloodlines were apparently extinguished during the final ritual. However, genetic researchers have identified individuals throughout the region who carry markers associated with the hereditary conditions that originally drew the cartographer's attention. These individuals often report unusual experiences, including heightened sensitivity to others' emotional states, chronic pain conditions that resist medical treatment, and vivid dreams involving the cult's symbols and rituals. The mystery of the Seventh Circle of Sacred Sorrows continues to haunt the Appalachian region, serving as a reminder of how isolation, desperation, and charismatic leadership can transform religious seeking into something far more sinister. The cult's systematic approach to cultivating and harvesting human suffering represents one of the most disturbing examples of how spiritual beliefs can be perverted into justifications for extreme cruelty. Their legacy persists not just in the physical locations they occupied, but in the psychological landscape of a region still grappling with the implications of their presence. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes those secrets keep the mountains. In the case of the seventh circle, the boundary between the spiritual and physical worlds may have been permanently altered, creating a lasting wound in the fabric of reality itself. The cult's belief that suffering could be transformed into spiritual energy may have been more than mere delusion, representing instead a terrible truth about the nature of pain and transcendence that humanity was never meant to discover. The seventh and final cult to emerge from Appalachia's hidden depths was perhaps the most insidious of all. While the previous 6 organizations relied on charismatic leaders and elaborate rituals, the Brotherhood of the Endless Sorrow operated as something far more dangerous, a networked infection that spread through existing communities like a spiritual plague, corrupting from within rather than establishing separate compounds. The Brotherhood's origins trace back to the winter of 1964, when a drifter named Marcus Thorne arrived in the coal town of Bitter Creek, West Virginia. Unlike the typical vagrant seeking work or shelter, Thorne possessed an unsettling quality that locals struggled to articulate. He appeared to be in his 30s, yet spoke with the weariness of someone who had witnessed centuries of suffering. His eyes held a depth that seemed to reflect personal knowledge of every tragedy that had ever occurred in the mountains. What distinguished Thorne from previous cult leaders was his approach. Rather than gathering followers around himself, he sought out individuals who were already broken by loss, addiction, or despair. He would appear at their lowest moments, offering not salvation, but validation of their pain. His message was seductive in its simplicity. Suffering was not meaningless, but sacred, and those who embraced their anguish completely would discover transcendence through perpetual sorrow. The Brotherhood's recruitment process was methodical and deliberate. Thorne would identify vulnerable individuals, often those mourning recent losses or struggling with chronic depression. He would befriend them gradually, never presenting himself as a religious leader, but rather as someone who understood their pain intimately. During these conversations, he would introduce the concept of sacred suffering, suggesting that their emotional torment was actually a gift that connected them to something greater than themselves. Those who showed interest were invited to participate in what Thorne called witnessing circles. These gatherings, held in basements, abandoned buildings, or remote forest clearings, involved participants sharing their most traumatic experiences in excruciating detail. The twist was that listeners were encouraged to absorb and internalize each other's pain, creating a collective pool of suffering that supposedly generated spiritual power. The Brotherhood's central ritual, known as the Endless Vigil, required participants to maintain a state of active grief for extended periods. Members would fast, sleep-deprive themselves, and engage in psychological techniques designed to keep traumatic memories constantly accessible, They believed that by preventing emotional healing, they could achieve a state of perpetual connection to what they called the source of all sorrow. As the Brotherhood's influence spread throughout Bitter Creek and neighboring communities, disturbing changes became apparent. Members would withdraw from normal social activities, spending increasing amounts of time in contemplation of loss and pain. Families reported that Brotherhood members seemed to actively seek out traumatic experiences, placing themselves in dangerous situations or deliberately sabotaging positive developments in their lives. The organization's growth pattern was particularly insidious because it operated within existing social structures. Unlike traditional cults that isolated members from their communities, the Brotherhood encouraged participants to maintain their normal routines while secretly spreading its philosophy. Members were instructed to identify and recruit other suffering individuals, creating a hidden network of people dedicated to perpetuating emotional anguish. Local mental health professionals began noticing alarming trends in the mid-1960s. Suicide rates in affected communities increased dramatically, but more troubling were the reports of individuals who seemed to be deliberately prolonging their psychological suffering. Therapists described patients who would sabotage their own treatment, claiming that healing would disconnect them from something essential. The Brotherhood's influence extended beyond individual members to affect entire families and social networks. Children of members often displayed signs of severe psychological distress, having been raised in environments where emotional pain was not just normalized, but celebrated. These children were taught that happiness was a form of spiritual weakness, and that true enlightenment required embracing suffering as a permanent state of being. By 1967, the Brotherhood had established cells in over 30 communities across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Each cell operated independently, but followed the same basic principles: identify the suffering, recruit through empathy, and create networks of individuals committed to perpetuating their own emotional torment. The organization's decentralized structure made it nearly impossible for authorities to combat effectively. The Brotherhood's practices became increasingly extreme as members competed to demonstrate their commitment to sacred suffering. Some engaged in self-harm, believing that physical pain enhanced their spiritual connection. Others would seek out traumatic experiences, such as visiting accident scenes or funeral homes, to absorb additional anguish. The most dedicated members practiced what they called empathic consumption, attempting to psychically absorb the pain of everyone around them. Marcus Thorne himself remained largely in the background, moving between communities and providing guidance to local leaders. Those who met him described an individual who seemed to embody the very suffering he preached. He reportedly never smiled, spoke in a voice that conveyed infinite sadness, and possessed an uncanny ability to identify and articulate people's deepest fears and regrets. The Brotherhood's influence on regional culture was profound and lasting. Communities affected by its presence developed a pervasive atmosphere of hopelessness that persisted long after active cells had disbanded. Local folklore began incorporating themes of inescapable sorrow and the futility of seeking happiness. Even today, certain areas maintain higher than average rates of depression and suicide, suggesting that the Brotherhood's psychological impact continues to reverberate through generations. The organization's end came not through law enforcement intervention, but through internal collapse. By 1969, many long-term members had descended into complete psychological breakdown, unable to function in normal society. The constant cultivation of suffering had created a population of individuals so damaged that they could no longer effectively recruit new members or maintain the organization's structure. Marcus Thorne disappeared sometime in early 1970, leaving behind only a handwritten note found in an abandoned cabin that read, "The sorrow is complete. The source has been fed. The work continues in those who remain." His fate remains unknown, though some former members claimed he had achieved his goal of becoming pure suffering, transcending physical existence entirely. The Brotherhood of the Endless Sorrow represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of all Appalachian cults. While other organizations relied on fear, isolation, or promises of supernatural power, the Brotherhood exploited the fundamental human experience of emotional pain. Its legacy serves as a reminder that the most dangerous spiritual movements are often those that validate and perpetuate our darkest impulses rather than offering genuine healing or growth. The impact of these 7 cults on Appalachian culture cannot be overstated. They emerged from the unique conditions of geographic isolation, economic hardship, and cultural insularity that characterized the region, but their influence extended far beyond their immediate communities. Each organization left behind a legacy of trauma that continues to affect the descendants of both members and victims, creating generational patterns of fear, mistrust, and psychological damage that persist to this day. These 8 families didn't just disappear from the mountains, they became part of them, their blood seeping into the very roots of the ancient peaks. From the Holes who made their pact in the depths of Widow's Peak to the Blackwoods whose rituals still echo through Shadow Creek, each family discovered that in Appalachia, prosperity always demands payment. The mountains remember every bargain, every sacrifice, every drop of blood spilled in desperation, and they're still waiting for those debts to be collected. So the next time you find yourself walking alone through those misty hollows, remember that some hungers are older than civilization itself, and they never truly die. They just wait for the next desperate soul willing to make a deal.